All right, so we're here this afternoon to talk about an interesting topic that we had multiple discussions actually about out in Denver at the iSummit, and this is the first of those conversations, and that's around the dynamics of an RFI, and really let's focus on our how might we, in ways that sow that statement. This is how we kick off most of our initiatives now. How might we solve the need for structured and dynamic governance of the RFI document throughout its life cycle in ways that account for differences in project type, phase of design, and impact on program, cost, or schedule, so that the aggregation of standard RFI metrics reveal insights that prevent similar scenarios from occurring. We want to bring some continuity, some standards to this, even though I'm sure you guys will start shaking your head up and down. The thing that we hear most when folks start talking about, well, how do you do this within a project is, well, it depends, right? So that's always a problem. What we're trying to do is try to bring some structure and make that go away as much as possible. So we have three folks with us that are going to contribute this afternoon. They are members of the two different teams that we had out in Denver talking about the subject. Benjamin, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Benjamin Crosby. I am the Director of BIM and VDC at Yates Construction. But my introduction to BIM and VDC was through digitizing project management back in 2000 and trying to get it digital workflows back then. And so I've been a big pursuer of how do we get this less carbon locker, less physical paper, and talking to each other. So happy to be participating again today. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Greg, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Kelly. My name is Greg Mattis. I'm a product manager at Ryvit, and we worked with Newforma to build the NPC Procore CDX integration, and are constantly looking for ways to automate data flow in the construction industry.
Thank you. Dustin, how about yourself?
Hi, I'm Dustin Williams. I'm the CEO over at Flywheel AEC, and we really focus on civil BIM and reality capture workflows for bridging the gap between design and construction. So we have a lot of input on RFIs, and our data is used a lot of times for RFIs. And I was lucky enough to join everybody in Denver at the beginning of this conversation.
All right, appreciate it. All right, so we're gonna just a quick orientation for those of you folks that were not at the iSummit. We went through a bit of a process, and we'll talk about it in the state of our current state, what we hope to achieve, and then the desired end state or the future state. So if you look at the whiteboard on the left-hand side, we probably spent half a day at least just constantly iterating, trying to identify who the players were, what kind of factors were involved, trying to gain some commonality to language. And it was really an interesting exercise to get different perspective from different folks. Some folks were representing their, as part of the team, specific roles within the context of the RFI. And it was their job to poke holes in the process and raise questions. Yeah, but I think about it this way. Right. And I thought it was a very dynamic experience, which was interesting that at the end of the first day, beginning of the second day, I don't remember the exact timing at this point, but we had an objective going into these conversations, and we put them up on paper here, actually on a sign that was standing up in the room, so we could constantly look at it to make sure we were working towards an objective. And then we kind of figured out that throughout the process, our objective really changed a little bit, and it crystallized, and I'm going to have Gregory talk about that here in just a second. But then we ended up in the screen capture here on the right, which is more of, here's what we'd like to get to. Here's the nirvana. We're going to get into this stuff in more detail and graphically so we can understand and see the relationships and the process and how that goes. And what we're going to ask folks to do is contribute and share their thoughts, questions that they might have as we go through it. But Greg, maybe you can take us through this shift in the objective and how your team dealt with this.
Yeah. So, right, we talked a lot about you know, obviously the same topic that you were talking about, but a big part of the theme was like, how do we bring all this data together in a way that we can start to like measure the impact of these RFIs and be able to prioritize these RFIs. And we, you know, we came around some solutions to that. But you know, the challenges were that, you know, an RFI can look different on one project, and an RFI can look different for different stakeholders on the same project, right? Like, you know, what the GC enters into Procore is not necessarily what the architect cares about in new forma, right? And you know, the architect at new forma may be you know, just going off whatever is in the contract of, you know, I need to respond to this thing within 10 days. And there's no real prioritization of these RFIs. And that's a big problem, right? And so a lot of things that we talked about were around like, how do we standardize the fields in RFI? How do we incentivize people to do that? And then in standardizing the RFI, it'll lead to being able to create better integrations, better automation, and then be able to define some fields that we can use to help prioritize those RFIs, to be able to identify like, here are the things that are the, you know, the burning fuse, and here are the things that can you know, wait a few weeks to be able to answer. And so that's kind of how we thought about it, and that's why we kind of modified the objective. And you see the so that piece. It's a little hard to read, but so that teams can prioritize and predict late stage RFIs, and that's really what we were trying to solve for in the end.
Excellent. Benjamin, Dustin, anything to add to from your experience there?
I think we came to a very similar conclusion. At least part of what we were talking about was certainly around being able to prioritize certain things, and agreeing upon that, like from a governance standpoint early on, so that everybody's the same page, and those that are, you know, higher priority, and why is it a priority, all agreeing to some of those things, like why is it a priority? Does everybody agree that it's a priority to do this, and who's ball and whose court at that point, if it does go high priority to get answered quickly? Also, like, whose eyes need to go on it, and then you know, like what level of project participant needs to participate in that answer, and does the owner need included, and things like that we can identify early on, rather than just simply from having maybe a good relationship between the contractor and the design team or something like that, more systematized.
Sure. How about you, Benjamin?
And, you know, we spent a lot of time out there on the middle one, improving access, reducing latency, mitigating risk, you know, redundancy, response time, React stages. And that's where I was really excited about it, and the conversations there about how we get those, you know, I guess not only the systems talking to each other, but if we get the systems talking to each other, we can end up with the people actually talking to each other, that then actually can have a conversation, that then those RFIs get prioritized better, taken care of better. And so that was the part that I really enjoyed about those 2 days and what we came away with.
Excellent. Appreciate all that input, guys. So this is an overview. Remember I said we were going to make it more graphically understood of our current state and then our future state, right? And we also tried to break it down to something that was less complicated to consume, but also understand the difference and the relationship between complicated and complex, two different things. And we'll cover that more here in just a minute. So what we're going to transition into now is understanding a little bit more about the different players and the stakeholders that were involved, because this is what the CDX system helps us to set up, to talk about it in specifics, to identify the people, identify the systems, identify the conversations, and really get that down. So you'll notice here we've accounted for all the stakeholders here, from your project owner through your engineer of record, And that was these were the folks that the team that came up with. And then within each one of those stakeholders, there are specific personas that are doing specific things. So there may be multiple personas within an organization that actually contribute in one of these scenarios. We wanted to make sure we identify the systems of record, because oftentimes there is a different, pretty much in every case, there's a different database, a different environment for the different stakeholders to work in. And then this document that we're talking about, the RFI, what are the different stages that that document is in as it passes through each one of these different phases. This is where things get interesting. So we started, I know we talked about it as a group, I'm sure you did as well based upon the notes that I saw, but this is a matrix of the activities and the metadata. So what are those key pieces of metadata that are necessary or required to be part of an RFI as it hits different stages of workflow in the process. So right now you can see only portion of that is filled in. In any particular scenario, we would want to exercise this completely, but there's a good point that that pretty much everybody brought up. There's different companies in play, there's different systems in play, different words mean different things in different systems. And this is a conversation that we need to push to the front of the project, give folks a way. You know, a concept that we came out of in our RFI group was something called dynamic governance, right? So governance is the internal policies and standards and systems that help folks understand how information and data flows between the systems that they may have. Well, there's also this larger project and platform ecosystem that everybody's involved in. How do you extend that governance between the systems, get commonality of language, things in that nature? A matrix like this is valuable within this process, but there's also a higher level matrix at the project level that all the stakeholders need to come to a certain amount of agreement on. And that's something we hope to develop after we've come to some agreement and brought everybody up to speed on this. Any of you guys have any comments or concerns, level of detail we should add here about the activities and the metadata?
I have one just comment. I was in a meeting today, and my name is Jim Andrews, by the way. I'm developing software, but I'm also a contractor. So I'm wearing two hats as I do this. So I'm trying to figure out how my solution can help resolve some of my problems over here. But I was in, and it was a Procore client. Most of our clients are Procore clients. And we were going through some pretty in-depth stuff on a pretty large project. And one of the dynamics that I was kind of clearly missing was how, you know, like in my arena, or I'm working with a fabricator, his arena, he assigns his number to it. And then as soon as it gets into the Procore system, which is natural and should happen, the GC's new number dictates that, you know. And there's this disconnect then that begins to happen where you're trying to find this stuff because you're looking at information that's in front of you, and it's got the originator's RFI number, but we're all looking at the new numbers, and just having those related document kind of things where all of that stuff really can carry throughout. So there's always those points of reference within that. And it was a little difficult to find the only way that they could do it. And that's the same kind of thing I've done on my end too at times, where you just put it in the title, but you know, pretty soon it gets big and stuff. So I was just looking in here to see what you had in that. And I think it's kind of one of those overlooked dynamics, I think, that needs to just be addressed in there, and would be really, really helpful, because then there's a whole series of different kinds of, the architect may have a different series of numbers, and it gives just a great point of reference.
That's a great question, Jim. Benjamin, I saw you shaking your head up and down pretty violently. So what's going through your mind?
So that comes up in that dynamics, and different projects run different ways. And how do we address that? Because we had that conversation back and forth. Like for us, we've started calling it an issue from the trades, and then making it an RFI when it goes to the architect or engineer to keep that official status. But then it's the same sort of thing. Two different numbers. How do we link those together? And preferably so we don't even have to retype it. So how do we? And that's part of this is when we map this out, if we do the exchanges, my ultimate future state is that you're no longer having to even go look that up according to another number. When it gets answered, it would get pushed back into your system under your number with a whole series of information that comes with it. Now, getting there and the steps in between, then yes, that project, we might have a trades identification number, whether that's an issue, an RFI, question number, whatever the team wants to call it, and then the RFI that officially got submitted to an architect or an engineer. So we've tried to address that in this process, but there is quite a bit of necessary flexibility around it as well. Did I hit on the right thing for you, Jim?
Yeah, I think that's it. You know, and that's the most difficult part for me as a subcontractor working with general contractors. And everything gets there. It's like even today, I'm chasing these numbers down and there, and it's great that all that stuff is there. I mean, because I remember not long ago when that wasn't available to us, so it's great having that access. But it's that ability to just quickly search. I'm staring at 600 numbers, and I know this number is 256 on my end, but it's 6 something over here. You know, it's like, where is that one? You know, and I'm trying to chase it down. And it's something as simple as that, where if you could just have that interrelationship where those things, and I'm doing this in my own system, you know, when it comes to time and material tickets and those related documents that stay there, because it's, once you have it, it makes things, you can sort, you can search, you can do all kinds of stuff to track it down. So
yes. And then the more information we push back and forth, and then, you know, whether it's in the title like you've done, I've done that before too, but hopefully in the future, we're not having to crowd in the titles or add a comment where, hey, this is my RFI 5 and this is your 38, because that at Yates, then we have we do a lot of self-perform. So I have electrical contractor, mechanical contractors, and they face the same problem all the time. How do they get their stuff pushed through?
that's pretty universal. So that's why you have companies like Ryvit, right? Figure out how to resolve that.
Getting a thumbs up from Greg. All right. Well, it's a great question, Jim, and it really sets the stage to understand the process here. And what you see is what the team mapped out for a typical RFI, or at least an RFI with this particular scenario. Because remember back to our original statement of, well, it depends. I know we had that like crazy on the RFI discussion we were talking about. But the important thing to see here is that there's a starting point, right? So you have an individual, a trade contractor, or a persona within that for creating an RFI. They're hand jamming an RFI into their own PM system, and then also into the system that the GC is maintaining. So there's your first point of either duplicate effort because it's only put into the GC system. I mean, if it's put into both, or there's no data in the trade contractor system because they only put it into the GC system. So we want to get rid of that shared pain, right? And then once you bring it into the process here, well, then it needs to synchronize up to the project engineer, who has to then go out and assign this thing to the right people, pushes it back into the system, which then connects to the AE system for that person to receive. And then they're going to start to assign out to folks internally to generate an answer. So we have step 8 here. And once they have said, oh, we need to have our engineer of record weigh in on this thing, it pushes it back out, notifies the engineer of record, multiple people inside of their organization that need now to weigh in on it. Once they weighed in on it, it's got to come back to the AE and the project manager to approve said collection of responses and pick one. Here's our official answer. Now they're going to push that back to everybody involved. And this whole time, the owner's sitting out here not knowing anything that's going on. They're not going to get any kind of notification until the PM system and the owner system get notification. Oh, we talked about this and we came to a decision here. Here's what you have to live with, right? There's all kinds of stuff in these records, and here you can see that are identifying other shared pains. Gregory, give us a quick thought on some of these shared pains that you guys talked about, and Benjamin and Dustin think about some of those from the context of the discussion as well, because I'd like to highlight some of those, because we're hoping to get rid of that in the future state, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, and you touched on them, right? Like there's a lot of duplicate entry that's happening, and that duplicate entry is bad for lots of reasons. It's bad from a you know, I'm wasting my time entering information into two systems. It is a potential area for data inaccuracies. Maybe I entered one thing in one system and something else in another system. It's creating this two sources of truth problem, right? Like there is a source of truth in the architect system, and there's a source of truth in the GC system. There's a source of truth in the trades system, right? And which one is the actual source of truth? You know, this could be a problem, you know, when it comes down to like really identifying, well, you know, what was said in the RFI, when was it submitted, when was it responded to, all these different sources of truth exist. And, you know, that's a big, you know, ball of beeswax, right? So, you know, that exists all over the place in here, right? You've touched on it with the trade system. You touched on it with, you know, trade and GC system. You touched on it with the GC and architect system. You know, there's the owner system that comes into play there. That, you know, sometimes the GC is entering into the GC system and the owner system, and so. It's a huge pain point for so many reasons, and it's something that we definitely discussed at a pretty deep level during the conference.
Thoughts, Dustin?
I think anybody that's on one of those endpoints is either entering in the data into their system and also into the GC system, or whoever's maintaining that system of record. It's a seemingly small thing, but really not, like losing access. So ideally you're entering it only into one system, and either all the things that happen in that one system get pushed back into your own, let's say you're the trade contractor system, or you maintain access to a certain part of that system. So it's really just the access level was a major, simple but major thing. Like you don't want to lose access to it. Without worrying about that, I think a lot more people would just jump into the main system of record.
Makes a lot of sense. Benjamin, I know in our pre-meeting what you're going to talk about when we get to the future state, and I think this note right here is what kind of sets the stage. What do you mean by progression happening in a closed environment is bad?
So that's the one I was getting all geared up for. So this is great. So my main problem here, yes, there's the records, and if people want their records, we can send them a PDF. They can have a copy of it. But what frustrates me most about this system is we want to be working collaborative. And you'll see in the chat, people were asking, well, are they using models? Are they talking to each other? And we're doing that on a lot of our projects now. And so lots of times that structural engineer, that mechanical engineer, those engineers over there on the engineering side, they want, you know, maybe we gave a proposed solution when we turned in the RFI, which we should every single time, but maybe they need to tweak that. And so let's have a conversation back and forth about it. Let's make sure that the answer doesn't create another problem. And so in this system here, that happens quite frequently. Sometimes we get back a pseudo answer. It's you know, one of the ones I had a great example was the answer to RFI 118 is in addendum 6, and addendum 6 doesn't post for another 10 days because they're compiling it. And so I didn't get my answer. That sort of thing is what I want to change, that progression, and I don't want it to be this closed environment. I would like people to see, you know, what's coming together as we go. So that old system, aside from all the documentation, I just want people talking to each other.
Yeah, like we talked, you know, like just briefly a moment ago about like, okay, we want to, you know, be able to prioritize these RFIs. But I think like a lot of value can be gained into just providing insight, right? Like I'm a trade contractor, and I was the person who first submitted this issue that got turned into an RFI that got chucked over the wall to the architect. Now the architect and the engineer are rapping about it. But like, you know, maybe I had this proposed solution in the beginning and the architect engineer like sees it a different way. Well, maybe it's great if like the engineer just talked to the trade contractor and there was insight across those two stakeholders so they can collaborate and come up with the solution that provides the most value to the project, right? And so, you know, there's a prioritization question, right? Sure, we get that, right? But just providing insight is hugely beneficial. And so I think that's kind of, you know, also what you're kind of touching on there, Ben.
Great
And
point.
so along that line, that if there's a way to identify in this impact partners, you know, I often go back to what we used to do, which meant I didn't have to do anything until somebody told me to do it. And that meant that I went to a box in a job shack and some project engineer had already gone through the plans and decided who was impacted by this issue. And because they didn't want to make 1,000 copies, they isolated it so we could get just what we needed. And those days passed with electronic, you know, information where the big data dumps can take place. But seeing too where you go through, because everybody enters this process at a different place. It's not a static process, you know, and there's hundreds or thousands of RFIs that take place, but how many of them really affect me, you know, and from a trade contractor perspective. But as they get identified and you can start to make those associations, if there was kind of this global dynamic of who the impact partners are, you know, because they usually cross over into multiple trades, but they don't cross over to everybody and never do, you know. So I don't know where that is in this process, but if there's that kind of identifier that as time went on and somebody recognized the fact that this may affect somebody else, that would be hugely helpful. Sure. You know, it wouldn't get buried.
So let's talk about that in the context of the future state here, right? So now you're seeing a different picture, right? Instead of individual line boundaries and information passing back and forth, this process is more collaborative. So we'll go through it, you know, a step at a time. So you have your trade contractor generating an RFI, either manually inputting it into the PM system, or even better, through integration, being able to push it into the PM system, right? Which then triggers the PM system to say, oh, okay, this needs to go to the AE system, right? And that project engineer makes that distinction manually, or they have automations set up to do so. And then it pushes over here. So are there particular levels of approval that are still required to have a conversation, or can we go straight into this collaborative approach, right? So if we're after step 3 and we want to go to step 4, that brings us over into this collaborative space, right? So here's where you're able to bring in the engineer of record, the trade contractor, the general contractor, and anybody else that you want to by invitation. And there may be an initial invitation, and we want these 5 folks in there. And then throughout that discussion, hey, well, we should get input from somebody else, bringing somebody else into the discussion. It's happening in this collaborative environment. So Benjamin, I think this talks to what you were describing. Nathan and I were having a conversation earlier today, and this is the question I think I'd like to stop and ask right now, or throw out there right now. How do stakeholders understand that they are in an unofficial collaboration versus it's documented, but it's not legally binding? It's that email thread, it's that chat conversation that isn't happening in a virtual room like this. It's still happening, and folks are not getting held to that standard until they say, here's the published copy, the approved copy. Is that something our industry needs to get used to, or what are your thoughts around that?
So yes, we are constantly having them get used to that now. And it's interesting. I see different reactions from different groups. I see, because really those email chains are legally, I mean, if you tell someone to do something, that means, hey, I've been authorized to do it. And so there's some firms that are like, hey, we want to have these conversations, and then we want to take, and when we push answer in the RFI, this is what the answer is. And those other conversations are conversations. And I have firms that roll to that really nicely. And I have some projects, firms, companies, others, even trade contractors and others that scares them because they're not used to that openness and that conversation. They want everything very formalized. And we miss things, kind of like what Jim was talking about. He says he wants to know which ones affect him. Well, what if that RFI started off with a plumber and now it's affecting Jim, right? When does he get pulled in on that loop? And so informally, if we can get people used to that by just stating, hey, we have to provide a mechanism, and that's where this map does a good part of it. At some point in time, that AE has to take that conversation that's taken place among their group of people and amongst participation of others and say, this is it, this is the answer, go with it.
Right. So as long as there's an audit trail of this collaborative, collective, circular conversation, then everybody's essentially covered via transparency, kind of like blockchain,
Yeah.
right? If everybody saw it happen, there's a record of it that anybody can access, then we're good. That we're creating some transparency.
We still have the same assignment of risk, right? The architect is the engineer of record, the architect of record. They have to answer some of that. There's legal obligation there to do that. And so there is risk assigned to them. There's risk defined to how we perform it. That never really changes, even when we have all this informal conversations. The thing with the informal conversations do is actually reduce the total amount of risk because we're getting better answers. And some people they have a hard time seeing that. And I think it takes a map sometimes like this to actually just show them this is how we do it now.
Makes a lot of sense. So then after this conversation, sorry, were you jumping in, Jim?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So after you have this collective conversation, your engineer is essentially going to say, here's the documentation to support whatever we talked about if there was any necessary changes there, right? All of that discussion and that particular documentation, which all happens in this virtual collective environment, now gets pushed over to the architect of record to make a formal decision and say, this is approved or this has been reviewed without comment, whatever is the official way for that organization to say, yes, I've answered the question, I'm passing it back to you. We now bring this decision into this, what we have described in the map here, this common data exchange, this integrated data environment where the different systems are talking to each other, and we can show that this is an actual audited decision, which then becomes a notification to multiple systems, right? That's where it gets pushed out to the GC system. It gets pushed out to the trade contract, it gets pushed out to the owner. Everybody's getting the result of that conversation and know that this is the official answer. The creative way we thought about describing this is your conversations inside that virtual room are passive. They're documented for record, so we know what people said. You can point back to the videotape, but you said this, right? But until you do an active exchange, a legal approval, that's when there's a recognition that there's risk assigned because a decision has been made. Is that fair, Greg, Benjamin, and Dustin? Does that jive with what we saw and talked about in the environment? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Very good.
Hi, this is Peg from Newforma.
Sure.
I just had a question. So when you're in that collaborative environment and you're documenting those discussions, is that where state could come into play? So for example, while we're in that collaborative state, we're in draft mode, draft state. So, using state to kind of formalize as we move through the process.
So that's how we're trying to get to this. We haven't been able to implement it quite nicely. We don't have the plugin that Newforma has, which I think is amazing. I want that for my system. But we use state to do that same thing. So we have, and it's out for response and then answered. And while it's out for response, then yes, everything is everything is comments, everything is suggestions. And then those comments they're all tracked, and then one is marked, this is the answer. And you might have to cut and paste from some of the others to get that one. That is the answer. The comments are there, the answer is there, and then the architect engineer says replied or answered, and that kind of walks it down, right? I mean, they can still have more comments, but you can't go back and change that answer without it being very obvious.
Mhm.
Does that answer the right thing for you, Peg?
Yes, I think so.
Excellent. Great discussion, folks. So wanted to try to put it into a different frame of reference as far as something being complicated or complex, right? So if we look at an RFI as a workflow, we can say it is reasonably complicated, and the further you move from left to right, the more and more complicated it gets, but it may just be a progression of steps. And if you follow the progression of steps, you can get a complicated process done with some efficiency. Once you start adding more layers, more parallel swim lanes, if you will, here is where it becomes more complex, because the complicating factors within this first row or this first row, whichever you're starting, bottom to the top, top to bottom, you're now amplifying that across each swim lane. And with each passing of the information back and forth, you're taking those complications and multiplying them by the number of players that are involved. So in our current state, we have a bunch of people passing information back and forth. Dustin, how many times have you seen typically on an RFI that it's a ping pong game? It's back and forth. It's a partial answer. I mean, Benjamin talked about it a little bit before and kind of quit at, well, it's only a partial answer. How many times does it go back and forth?
It depends if we have those sidebar meetings or if it's an email exchange, and if the right questions are getting answered or asked and answered. So, quite a few quite a few times. I think it ties into what we were talking about a second ago too, where the workaround is that the email gets sent instead of asking the questions through a common data environment. It's getting off like sidelined, and then having it, if you have to bring anybody in, they're like clueless, they can't get themselves up to speed. So another reason why you might have more ping pongs back and forth too, as it gets escalated, if it is more complicated than the original person expected.
So to bypass the complexity, we bypass the whole process and we take it out into something that may or may not be part of the project record anymore, right? If it's an email, maybe you can capture it in the project record, depending upon what system you're using or systems you're using. If it's on WhatsApp, it's gone, right? It's a phone call, it's gone. Nobody's got any record of anything. So when we look at our future state, we're still starting off with a trade contractor letting a general contractor know, I have this official notification that I have a question. Now it gets passed into this collaborative environment. And instead of having to go and play ping pong, it's a collaborative conversation. It can happen inside a digital environment where we can capture that conversation, capture those details, and then come to a decision. And then once that decision is made, again, the AE says, I have an answer. I've selected an answer because I have the authority to do so, passes it back to the GC, back to the trade contractor. So it really reduces the complexity of things, because you now have two lanes. You have notification, and then you have transparent collaboration resulting in official notification of an answer. So greatly simplified, both from a complexity and being a complicated problem. Any guys have any comments around this process? I hadn't looked at it this way before, but Nathan threw it out there, and I thought it was really interesting. So would love your input here.
I think it's like a more efficient way of doing like a big room method. So a big room, you just get every single person who might need to make a decision on the project in a room and meet a regular basis. That is incredibly inefficient, but it gets all the answers flushed out pretty well. So it almost seems like this is more virtual, more remote friendly, more efficient kind of way of making sure that there's not like the empty seat problem, but also, you know, you're getting those people together in a more collaborative way without having to agree to anything or any like pricing, like go back and you do the pricing, but you talk about pricing openly in general terms, maybe in that group meeting. Makes sense to me.
So I love this diagram. I've always interpreted as number of participants and number of options. And we have lots of participants in an RFI, and you have almost infinite options for solution. And so it's always going to be complex. And then I interpret complicated as the number of decisions somebody has to make to get through something. And that's why everyone loved Angry Birds so much when everyone played Angry Birds. There wasn't a lot of decisions. It was just pull and shoot, pull and shoot. And if we can do that with RFIs to where we don't have to make a whole bunch of decisions. So we're going to route an RFI. Do we have to send it to this person? Do we have to include this person? And so as we were going through there, then Jim talked about, you know, being copied on his, and I still have projects that I have to go talk to because they love to CC, you know, 38, 40 different people on every RFI, and inboxes are overflowing, and every one of those people has to make another decision. I have to read this RFI, see if it appeals to me. And so if we can change the complication out of it by automating a bunch of those decisions, everyone gets all of the information, right? They get to see what's the latest information. If we're copying them on keywords or something as we go, and we can be more efficient rather than just a blanket copy, then we take a bunch of that complication out of it, and we're able to do our complex work without that. RFIs are often considered dreadful, right? That no one's like, hey, I'm going to go answer RFIs. We want to take the dread out of RFIs and make it part of the project again.
All fantastic input from everybody. I'm going to jump back here to the one that shows both in play. Where are we? So let's take some time now. We've had a bunch of good input from folks, certainly our stakeholders from the summit meeting. I'd like to open it up to the group, and does the current state and the future state, you know, does it resonate with you? Do you see holes in it? Are we missing something? You know, we want to try to drive what we did in this summit to white papers and show something that comes out of this particular process. But just because you weren't there doesn't mean you shouldn't have input to the process. So we'd love to hear what anybody thinks about. Do we accurately represent the current state and the future state? Is there any input there? So I open it up to the floor.
Kelly, I have another question for you.
Sure.
Full of questions today. So is there any relationship back to the contract? So contractual obligations that are spelled out for RFIs, you know, kind of the do's and don'ts. To me, that's like the governance piece of this. And I'm just wondering like how that fits into this.
Typically, it's time driven, and that's one of the biggest risks for trade contractors is that within their contractor, they have so many days to respond to certain things, and then within the RFI, there's a certain response time. And if you miss that, you're potentially at huge risk, you know. It's kind of an all or nothing approach. That's what we run into. That's where I get, as an owner, get the most frightened is what did we miss, you know, and I think it's bridging that gap. I've yet to really have somebody throw that back where I missed something in a reasonable amount of time, you know. And that if it's 6 months later and now you're going back and realizing you did out of scope work that was part of an RFI and you didn't account for it, that's, you know, that's your loss, you know, on that. So I think it's really time driven, and I think that's why so much of this is important, is being able to even draw that out into the surface. Is even the reminder piece. You know, that's what we get to do with technology, is actually get things in front of people. And so it's not just you in the workflow, but it's like, well, okay, now that you have that workflow, how do you get it in front of people as well?
Right.
And you know, from an owner's perspective, I would think that the more transparency in that realm, the less risk they have as well.
EJ, it looks like you have some input on that one too.
Yeah, I was just responding to the question, right? Someone asked, like, what are RFIs used for, right? And they can be used for good means, but essentially an RFI is the contractual change mechanism. You're changing your initial contract documents, which is the specs or the drawings. But we've all seen it, right? RFIs can get abused by just people creating like a ton of RFIs, like for dimensional layouts. Dimensions aren't shown on the drawings. Well, you got to RFI it because you're not supposed to scale the drawing. So you submit an RFI to get those dimensions back and forth. And it's things like that that really bog down the entire process. Rob and I have been kind of chatting with each other here, and I feel like part of this, right, when you talked about like that status, or like if the RFI is there, like, is it really a critical RFI? Or is it an RFI that we're just putting a pin in, sticking it up there because it's something we need to address, but it's not critical. The design team doesn't need to address it in this moment, right? Because it's all about kind of, everybody's busy, everybody's got a million things to do. And if you send them 100 RFIs and you tell them they all need to be answered in 2 weeks, they're going to be like, okay, then I'm not going to be able to review all your submittals that you have stacked up on top of me, or all of these other things. I feel like whichever system you're using, there's got to be a means to identify of like, hey, this is actually a critical RFI that needs to be responded to because it's going to hold us up from putting work in place. Or we saw something in our drawing review that we might need some clarification on, but you can just pin it up there for now and then address it later. And that's where I feel like people need to, it's all about just communication. You got to talk, right? You got to be like, hey, what's, you know, is this a critical RFI? Okay, then we'll try to get it done. And I like with Benjamin's response, design teams, I think, really appreciate when you actually come forward with a solution instead of just like throwing it over the fence and go, here, figure it out for us. I feel like sometimes those confirming RFIs or RFIs with a proposed solution, usually, I mean, it's already been figured out. They're just confirming that that response or that solution you offered is acceptable.
Jeffrey, looks like you're weighing in. Thinking about weighing in. I see a lot of head shaking going on.
I mean, we've all been dealing with this, right? A lot of us have been in the industry a long time, but we're still struggling with RFIs.
Well, and I think, you know, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and I think, you know, we keep trying to put Band-Aids on it instead of going back to why we're generating them in the first place, right? So, you know, I asked the question, what is a typical reason for an RFI? And I mean that like in the dumbest way. Like, what kind of question is being asked in an RFI? Is it something that should have been decided in the design process and it wasn't decided, or it wasn't properly documented? And then the question is, if that keeps happening, then that should be on a checklist somewhere, that the next time that a project is done, the same mistake isn't made. So the same RFI isn't asked from project to project to project. Because every time I talk to people about this, it seems like, you know, contractor says, well, we always have these kind of RFIs. Like, well, then have you told anybody that very thing? And then said, you know, next time we work with that architect or that owner or whatever, that at the top of the checklist during the design process, make sure this is taken care of. And then, but then you have to have like a sort of a carrot and stick sort of, you know, system put in place that says, hey, fewer RFIs we have because the better job that you guys do in clarifying the information up front, here's the carrot. The stick is, you give me another one of those damn RFIs on this project and it's on you. And this is the penalty for it, right? And I know that seems a bit simplified and maybe even a bit draconian, but it seems like that's how this industry responds to things, right? By either carrot or stick. Tell a contractor they get $100,000 for every day they're early on a project. They're bust their ass to make sure they get that 100, as many of those days as possible, right? Tell a contractor you're penalizing them $200,000 for every day they go over. They're going to make sure they at least meet that deadline, right? So I think we should be looking at how do you build that same sort of incentive system so that you even reduce the amount of these things being done, right? And I'm not even, and that's even just looking at just pure process, business processes and all of that, you know, whether it's design, bid, build, IPD or whatever process. If I look at it from a technology perspective, if I'm in a model-based workflow, there's ways to do that now where all of that information is consolidated. Somebody mentioned CDEs. There's lots of systems out there that are now integrating BIM into these processes in a way that says, well, it doesn't matter how many different systems with every different RFI number from every different thing is created. Doesn't matter. I could put 1,000 different classifications on it, doesn't matter. But if it's attached to a model that says, in this place, in the building, on this floor, in this room, there's this issue, it's documented once and everybody can go to it and say, oh yeah, and everybody can see it. There's your transparency. And when the answer is created, then the answer is established. It's written down. The issue is closed, but there's always a record of it. And so we have these mechanisms available to us. I think the hardest part about it is getting people to discover them and then work towards integrating them into that process, right? Along with this idea of, okay, how do I quit generating so many RFIs in the first place? How do I do best practices? How do I demand best practices out of the design team so that there's generating less questions? And then even as we know during the construction process, when things pop up, substitutions, you know, because of supply chain problems or whatever, that's fine. But what are those procedures then that determine if an RFI is even appropriate, as was also mentioned? And if it is, how do you automate that particular type, right? And so again, you know, I'm looking at this from the bigger point of view and systematically and saying, well, it just sounds like we're still just trying to put a Band-Aid over a broken system. So fix the system, you know? Don't keep putting oil in the leaky car, fix the oil leak. Quit spending money on more and more oil.
I feel like it's more of a people issue and
Yes.
a behavioral thing,
Totally behavioral cultural.
because I've worked with project teams who worked very collaborative with the design team, and they had less than 10 RFIs on the project. They took a lot of pride in that. And then I've had other PMs lead projects, and they RFI'd everything because they got burned in the past one time for not actually getting an official RFI, and then lost money on it. So then those jobs have hundreds and hundreds of RFIs, and they're all these like little RFIs that totally bog down the process. So you're right. We could have a system that exists and it does all this right now, and you would still have people not want to follow it that same way.
So yeah, so then that I think that gets back into that idea of how do you incentivize it in a way for everybody to get on board to do it the best way, rather than, you know, flailing around and saying, oh, well, even though we have all the tools available to us, this company doesn't do it that way, and then that just mucks everything up.
I've had design teams actually tell us we don't have any more budget in our CA to respond to RFIs, so you're just going to have to figure it out. We're like,
yeah, don't work with that designer ever again.
What? Like, how do we not submit more RFIs when we still haven't even finished completing the project and there's still more questions out there?
Yeah, if we could just not work with every company that said something silly at one point in time, we wouldn't build anything, right?
I know.
Well, you know, but we do this all the time in every other day life, right? If somebody doesn't step up and provide us a service, we don't use them again.
Yeah.
And again, what are the incentives? What is the carrot and stick? And Kelly and I have talked about this before. You know, what is the carrot and stick of doing the right thing? Because not everybody's going to do the right thing just because it's the right thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think everybody has to do a better job of holding each other accountable for doing the right thing, the best thing. And, you know, we're still broken. I know from the design side, I know from the architecture side, it is so seriously still broken in so many different ways to be able to do the right thing every time.
That's my concern a little bit, is that we get too utopian in our viewpoint and we don't resolve the issues right in front of us today. Because I'm so far down the food chain that it doesn't matter what incentives you do up there. I'm still just gonna get dumped on me, whatever gets dumped on me, and I have to figure out how to deal with it. And so that's the unfortunate part. But I think there's commonality that we got to, and I think transparency can start leading towards that and building transparent systems. Like the use of RFC. I mean, DJ, what you were talking about, there used to be a time we had different terms that would get used. I don't see those terms getting used much anymore. An RFC would be request for clarification. That's when I need different deals, but I don't see that. I just see RFI. So it's getting back to commonality where we can all agree and say, this means this, this means this, this means this, and then we can segregate the complex from the simple and do that. But one of the things I'm seeing more and more too with this labor issue is the lack of the workload at the architectural engineering level and their inability to respond to this stuff now too. It's affecting the whole, you know, it's a different kind of supply chain issue that's now being felt.
I've had conversations
right
with
way.
Go ahead, Rob. Sorry.
I was just going to say that's why, to the incentives and the talking about the right way, the solution is you have to make the right way the easy way. And a lot of that has to do with the labor issues that we're currently facing, but it also just has to do with the way that humanity's evolving. That's what everybody's used to, right? Is everybody defaults to the easiest and least obstructed path. You know, DJ and I were chatting a little bit about certain software has the ability for the design team, when they get that notification email, to just reply to that email with their answer and attach their revised drawing. And it's amazing how many people just simply don't even know that that's available, right? So it's a super mega easy way to do it. It makes it easy to do it the right way, but just simply because they're not educated or don't have the time, you know, in the current market to get educated, they don't even know. So that's a huge focus for me for like everything I do now, is make the right way the easy way. And, you know, and if you don't, to the point about like financial incentives and stuff, there's a point at which, you know, socioeconomically or like statistically, it's shown that just doesn't move the needle for an individual. You know, an extra 20 grand in the paycheck of somebody that's making 200 grand already, you know, maybe not, you know,
Not
making extra money for the company, maybe not, if I don't get a chunk of that. But, you know, I think the universal incentive is if you make it easy, you know, people will choose the easy path.
I think the other thing I've had, like, sorry, Benjamin, I've had conversations with project teams where they just like constantly want to pick on the design team for these deficiencies in their drawings. And I'm like, hey, you got to have some empathy for them, because some of these things that happened, they're not intentional mistakes. It just happens. And like, until telling them, like, unless you've been on that side and you're the one managing the drawings and creating the drawings and doing all that other stuff, you have no idea what it's like to really do that. So have some understanding and some empathy with the design team, and where you talk, instead of just like pounding them with RFIs and said, you guys suck at your job, just be like, hey, we just, you know, it's about how, it's your tone and how you approach them. Like, hey, our team needs this in order to do this. Can we get that taken care of in an RFI and some of these other things? If you just explain to them like the need, instead of it just, because I feel like if I'm on the design side, I'm just constantly get bombarded with these nickel and dime RFIs. Then yeah, I'm gonna have a bitter taste to it. I'm gonna be like, you know what? I will take every bit of the 10 days that I have to respond to this. And instead of like building the relationship, having some empathy, helping them manage the workloads, be like, you know, in all reality, these 3 RFIs, I need them as soon as possible. These other 10, they can wait. We can even push those dates out a little bit so you can address those. That's where, again, it's the people part of just having the conversation, instead of just standing behind the software or whatever it is and be like, here's your RFIs, go answer all of them. You'll never get anything done.
So I think that when we're actually looking to change the industry. I mean, that's why I'm so excited. I was AGC XML and then COSA, and now we're CDX, and we're actually seeing change, because when we talk about people, 2 to 5% of people are innovators that are going to want to change something like this just because, hey, there's a chance to do something better. And we're on this call. We're all right here. We're all 100% on board. You're going to have 15% of early adopters that if it's there, they will do it, right? No persuasion, nothing that's like, hey, we got a better way. Great, let's do this. You're going to have 33% of early majority that they have to watch somebody else. They have to see this happen, right? And they're going to do it. Those are the people, and that gets us a little more than halfway through all the people out there, if we have the system in place and we can do it. So that's, to me, it's a huge deal that Newform put together and had this interface actually taking place, because that gets that early majority and they'll do it. You have the late majority, which need the stick that Jeffrey was talking about, right? Someone's going to have to thump them on the back of the head to get them to come along. That's another 33%. And then you have that 15% that drive us nuts. There are skeptics. They're never going to do it. They're going to tell us everything that's wrong with it, but we got to take really good notes where they're telling us everything that's screwed up and how messed up we are in the head and nothing's ever going to change, because they'll tell us everything that's gone wrong in the past and we can fix it. And then we just let them drift off into, maybe they'll decide that they want to go work at Home Depot, and that's fine with me. Right. We'll just let them go. Right. I don't try to convert the skeptics. I don't waste any of my time with them other than writing down everything they tell me that's going to be wrong. They're a wealth of knowledge. And so if we can overlay that natural curve that happens, I went through it with BIM. I'm going through it with CDX. I go through it when I try to get the school system to change the playground. Right. They have different playground at school. 15% of the people hate me. And so when we overlay that with, when we can lay out the technology and give people a means to do it, we grab that other 33, almost 66%. And I think that's what Nathan has helped us all to do, is pulled us in with this. He's leading the charge. So then how do we refine what we have, what we're walking through today, and take as much of the complexity out of it, or the complication? It's always going to be complex, as much of the complication out, so that the other 33% can step on board. And Jim, I think that's your answer there. We might be far down the food chain, and I've tried to push this from different positions where I was really far down that food chain and so far down there. But if it's easier for people to get to the food, then they will follow us.
Yep, I agree with that. What Rob was saying, I mean, even my own product and getting my own people to use it, it's like I have to show them that it's easier and better than what they currently do. And when they can see that, and then from my perspective, there's an ROI attached to that. And as soon as you can sell the ROI, it's like huge. But it has to start with ease. It has to be better than what they currently do. And as soon as you show people that, that's when they can buy in.
Rob mentioned the some people that just won't reply to the email. Like, it's so easy, just reply to the email to put your answer in the system. I had that recently with a large architectural firm. Just reply to the email. You don't have to log in, you don't have to do anything, just be replying, and it's all going to take care of itself. And they know we can't do that because, and they gave me a very bureaucratic answer. That's that 15% that you just go get a job somewhere else, right? You're so beaten by this system, and it is their system that's beat them down, but no effort to figure it out or do anything. But I try not to get discouraged by that, because there's 85% of people that we can move.
Mm-hmm.
So we have about a minute left. At least I think that's what, based upon the note from Nathan a few minutes earlier. So I'm going to come back to where we started. So how might we solve the need for structured and dynamic governance of the RFI document through its life cycle in ways that account for differences in project type, phase of design, and impact on program cost or schedule, so that the aggregation of standard RFI metrics reveal insights that prevent similar scenarios from occurring? I heard all those elements in our conversation today, and that to me that's encouraging because that means we're getting somewhere, right? And we're talking about these things, and really that ultimate point would be fantastic because it brings us back to the root problem that Jeffrey brought up. If we can learn from the mistakes that we're making because we can classify things the right way and we can quantify and we can benchmark, well, then we can not make them the next time, and there's less low quality RFIs. There will always be some need for RFI, but we'll have less low quality if we'll take time to go through that process. So thanks everybody for participating today, and we'll see you back in the main session.
Kelly, without further ado, why don't you take it away? What did you guys talk about?
We had a great synopsis of what we covered at the summit in Denver. It was really a great exercise, especially for those folks who were not able to attend, to see the level of preparation, the level of complexity, the robust conversation that happened there that I think brings us all at the end of the day to our desired end state, which is moving the ball forward. It's a conference where you did something more than run up a bar tab. It was actually a fantastic conference for that reason alone. So let's start with the end in mind. When we look at the statement that you just put up, we want to stop making the same mistakes every time, right? Why are we putting in so many RFIs? Because either we're still making the same mistakes or we're trying to CYA for mistakes that we've seen in the past, and we want to make sure we don't get caught up in doing that. So we spent a lot of time identifying who the people were, the processes, to talking through that, how we have the shared panes that you're seeing on the screen in different places, and you're seeing a very linear output of it goes from here, goes to there, it goes back, and then you play ping pong back and forth until a decision is made, which is increasing risk for everybody. It's increasing the complexity for everybody because you're already taking a complicated process, and every time you pass it back and forth between folks, you're increasing the complexity because of all the relationships between the people, the systems, and the technology that they're using. So we really drove towards the desired future end state, which is more collaborative. What we're trying to do is help folks see that if we can bring folks together within the context of that RFI, right? And once we across the top of the slide you see in front of you are passing the information to let everybody know, okay, there's something to discuss here. We bring them into that gray gear on the upper left-hand corner and actually sit down and talk to each other. Now, this is virtual, this is through a process, but it is involving the folks in the process who need to be part of that conversation. So that way, there's a clear distinction between things that are discussed to get to a solution without playing ping pong. You're doing it in the same virtual environment to then lead to a decision that now becomes from a passive documented conversation to an active exchange. Architects, project manager, architect of record, I've approved the answer that came out of this discussion. And then it becomes a notification process to everybody else. Because on different projects, different folks want different levels of notification. Sometimes owners want to know about everything from the beginning. Sometimes they don't want to know about anything until there's some cost or schedule change. But then when there's a problem, now all of a sudden they want the documentation of what was discussed. There's all kinds of variables there. At the end of the day, that's driving a need for governance and dynamic governance. We have some static information that's always going to be the same. It's not going to change. But then you start introducing different teams with different systems, and the rules and processes that bring those together, that is going to be different on every project. So that needs to be dynamic, and it needs to be defined and something we can drive to the beginning of the project. And that's where that's all what we discussed, and lots more. So watch the video to learn all the details.
So you're saying the answer is it depends.
There you go.
Surprise, surprise. There's a theme going on here.